website. Okay. We're at 2 after, and I know that everyone is busy in this crazy month of February. We shall begin. My name is Ji Hang Lee. I'm the Senior Vice President for the Association of Community College Trustees. Thank you so much for joining us to review of our timely policy priorities for community colleges, more affectionately known as our green sheet. And unfortunately, I think the copy that you will see online isn't green, but we're remiss, we still are calling it the green sheet. We're sad that we're not seeing all of you in Washington, D.C. next week, but hopefully we'll see all of you soon. I am joined by my colleagues, David Baime, who's the AACC Senior Vice President for Government Relations and Policy Analysis, Katie Brown, who's ACCT's Director of Government Relations, Jim Hermes, who's the AACC Associate Vice President for Government Relations, and José Miranda, who is the ACCT Senior Government Relations Associate. As I said again, if you want to post your questions in the Q&A, we'll address those accordingly. And thank you so much for joining us today to talk a little bit about our priorities and the importance of these issues going forward. I'm going to turn it over to Katie Brown, who is on our ACCT team, and she'll go over the agenda and talk a little bit about the green sheet itself.
Thanks, Ji-Hang, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for taking time out of your day to join us. We will be reviewing the green sheet, as Ji-Hang mentioned today. We'll be talking about what the green sheet is for those of you who may be new. We'll also review the green sheet and talk through our 2021 joint legislative priorities. And those include supporting community colleges and students during the pandemic, supporting dreamers, strengthening higher education tax benefits, reauthorizing the Higher Education Act, and investing in higher education and workforce development. So just a quick overview of the green sheet before I hand it off to my colleagues to discuss. Every year we come together and release our top legislative priorities for the year. This is what we refer to as the green sheet. For those of you who attended the first webinar in this series, we talked through our entire 2021-2022 joint legislative agenda, which we release every 2 years. And every year we kind of pull from that document the top timely priorities for community colleges. So that's what the green sheet is. And typically it's released right before our annual National Legislative Summit, which is happening next week from February 8th through 10th. We hope you're all going to be able to join us for that. It's going to be a great event. And also you can utilize the green sheet kind of as a tool to talk with your federal policymakers, either during next week when you attend the summit, or this month, or for the rest of the year. It's kind of a great resource to highlight the top priorities and to share them with your federal legislators as kind of a more succinct one-pager. And also we really encourage you to, kind of review the sheet and then pick out, the issues that are most important to your institutions and students, as we know that can differ across regions and states. So this is definitely something you could use to prioritize and personalize for your federal legislators. And with that, I will turn it over to Jim to get us started.
Thanks very much, Katie, and thank you all for joining us here today. Starting with the first topic on our green sheet, as you can see here, funding community colleges and their students to meet the pandemic's challenges. This is in relation to what is already underway in terms of process, and I'll talk about that in a second. Depending on how you count it, we're talking about now the fifth major legislative package to aid in the nation in the recovery from the pandemic. This includes the CARES Act and the Coronavirus Relief and Supplemental Appropriations Act that were passed last year. With the change in administration and the change in congressional control in the Senate, they are immediately launching into consideration of an additional package, including funding for things such as vaccination, states and local governments, a whole host of other things, extension of unemployment benefits, and so forth. What Congress is working on or starting to work on is a package proposed by President Biden that totals $1.9 trillion. It's been very much in the news. I'm sure you're aware of that. That package includes $170 billion for education overall, And out of that, $35 billion is earmarked for higher education. So this is, this is what Congress is starting to work on in terms of actually turning that proposal into legislation. And as you can see here on this, and as you can see here on the slide, we have our own recommendations, particularly this first one for that package, and that is rather than $35 billion for higher education, we are advocating for $97.3 billion in that package for assistance to institutions of higher education. That sounds like a bit of a strange number, I know, and I'll tell you how we got that. Basically, over the course of the past year, the higher education community working together arrived at a figure of $120 billion in total to address the needs, including costs that institutions have undergone, lost revenue that they have incurred, all the things associated with the pandemic and all the expenses that has entailed for colleges and universities, as well as the students that they serve. As you are likely aware, a portion of this money needs to go to student grants, half of it under the CARES Act and a somewhat smaller percentage under the CRRSA bill. So those two things together, a lot of need combined in both of those categories. And over the course of the past year, the higher education community, with assistance from all of our members in terms of providing information, determined that at least at one point last year, and the number is probably bigger now, that the number was $120 billion. That is the amount of costs and lost revenues that institutions had experienced. And that was the position that we all coalesced around in terms of a dollar figure. The Carissa bill, as we're calling it, provided $22.7 billion for higher education. So the $97.3 billion then is the remainder of that $120 billion. It's obviously a very large ask. It is ambitious, but as I said, it's been documented and as I mentioned also before, probably actually underscores the amount of need out there in the higher education community. Just a bit about what's happening now in Congress, as I alluded to earlier. The Democrats in control of the House and the Senate are starting to move forward in terms of enacting this package. They are likely going to use a process called budget reconciliation. I'm not going to get into exactly what that means. That's a whole webinar in and of itself. And there's going to be more opportunity to learn about that at the National Legislative Summit. But they're going to likely use a process called budget reconciliation, which the most important feature of that is the fact that if you use that process, you can pass legislation through the Senate with a simple majority of just more than 50 votes. And of course, since the Senate is split 50-50 with a majority belonging to the Democrats because they have Vice President Harris as the tie-breaking vote, they will likely need to use that reconciliation process unless they can arrive at a bipartisan agreement where 10 or more Republicans join in the 50 Democrats to vote and get over that 60 vote filibuster threshold. That does not appear at all likely that will happen, particularly at that $1.9 trillion size. So reconciliation is likely going to be used. And what the start of that is, you have to pass a budget resolution to start that, and that is what's happening now, right now in Congress as we speak. Now, it's as I said, I'm not going to get into the details of reconciliation. The most important factor is this simple majority benefit that it entails. But it does come with a lot of limitations. Most importantly, that everything in a budget reconciliation bill has to have all the provisions have to have a direct impact on the budget. And if it's found that a provision does not meet that requirement, it can be struck from the bill. It's a bit of an open question. I just mentioned that by saying it's a bit of an open question whether the higher education or the education funding in general, along with several other things in the bill, would actually be qualified under that process and be able to stay in the bill, because these monies went out before under what we call discretionary appropriations. That is not usually something that you do through the reconciliation process. So we have a little bit of an unknown territory here, and we're all going to be watching very carefully as this moves forward. But in terms of your advocacy, really the important information. With that sort of background in mind, the important information that you have there is this dollar amount that we're seeking on behalf of all higher education. The other thing to mention real quickly, as you see here on the slide, we're very happy with the use of funds language, although we have some issues to clear up with the implementation of the last bill, but very happy in general with the use of funds language that was used. It was much broader. It allows institutions, particularly in the area of lost revenue, to do more things than they were able to do under the CARES Act. And we want funding to be distributed along the same formula. That formula, to refresh your memory, under the latest bill, under Carissa, was a formula that was half based on headcount enrollment and half based on FTE enrollment, with the other categories being Pell enrollments, non-Pell enrollments, and a little bit for distance education students. We like the way that it turned out. It was very beneficial for community colleges, to the tune of about $1 billion to use that headcount / FTE formula rather than a strictly FTE formula. So that's what we want to see in the final bill. Now, likely, I will add that if they do move forward with reconciliation, what we had in place in the Carissa bill will likely be the provisions there will likely be what the funding will be done through, but we don't know that entirely yet. We haven't seen any legislative text for what they're going to do. Now, secondly, the second item on this slide is we continue to advocate very strongly for a large community college job training program to help with the post-pandemic recovery and beyond. Obviously, the pandemic has really heightened the need for workforce training. 10 million fewer jobs are in the economy than there were at the beginning of the pandemic. Some of those will come back, but certainly not all of them will. So we're going to have a lot of people, and we do have a lot of people that are going to require workforce education. So we're advocating for a $2 billion program that's the same size that we had under the TAC grant program from a few years back. Just in terms of process, most likely where this is going to fit in is a second package that the Democrats want to do later this year. So right now they are very focused on this first package, which is more of an immediate response to the pandemic, as I mentioned. They want to do hopefully a second package, which is more of an economic recovery package, including things like infrastructure, green energy, and so forth. And that would be the most likely place where we would fit this community college program into. Again, this package, this second package that they want to do, there is a pretty good chance that it also will move under this budget reconciliation process that I was talking about later this year. They will first have to pass an FY 2022 budget resolution and move forward from there. If they do that, the most likely option for this new community college program is to essentially refund the TACT program. It's an authorization that was already there, and in fact, it was originally funded itself through a prior reconciliation bill. If they can move that package through what I would call regular order, in other words, through a non-reconciliation process, then the options are much greater in terms of what that package and what that community college program might look like. And in that case, you start looking at things like the Relaunching America's Workforce Act, which is something that we worked with Congress on to get into authorizing legislation. But there are other options potentially as well for what such a program might look like. But that's not something so much to worry about now, just a bit of background. In terms of your advocacy at the NLS, really the bottom line is that we are ready to help the nation recover economically from this pandemic, and is also address the ongoing skills gap that existed even before the pandemic through this large community college-led job training program. Turning to the next slide, a long time item for those of you who are NLS veterans on our green sheet, and that is to support Dreamers and enact legislation that will give Dreamers a permanent path to citizenship. Just by a little bit way of background, you can see there that we have almost 800,000 Dreamers that have been beneficiaries of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or DACA. And as you're all aware, the Supreme Court issued a decision last year that vacated the Trump administration's rescission of the DACA program, putting it back on its footing as it existed in September 2017 before the administration moved to rescind that program. Subsequent court orders, a couple of federal court orders after that Supreme Court decision, ordered the Department of Homeland Security to start accepting new applications from people that had not yet had DACA protection. And those are primarily going to be your younger people that are aging into it. You have to be at least 15 years old to get DACA. And so there are thousands of students that could potentially qualify once they turn old enough. So there are actually a little over 2,700 students, not just students, a little over 2,700 individuals have actually filed new DACA applications since those court orders through the end of the month of December. Now, it's important to remember, just in thinking about this, that the Supreme Court decision was based on procedural grounds. And in fact, there is ongoing litigation to challenge the DACA program, the legality of the program itself. And there was a hearing in that case held in a Texas federal court in December, late December, and we're awaiting the decision from that case. All that really goes to show is that we really need legislation in this area. So even with everything that's happened with the Supreme Court decision, the acceptance of new applications for the DACA program, those people are still very much on very tenuous footing, and we're in particular because there's litigation ongoing to challenge it. Even without that tenuous footing, DACA can't provide these people with a path to citizenship. Only legislation can do that. So we've continued to strongly advocate for the DREAM Act or similar legislation to really solidify the ground under these people's feet and put them on a path to citizenship. And I'm going to turn it now to the next person. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. This is David Baime. Thanks, everybody, for being with us. And we're going to give you a pop quiz on reconciliation at the end of this program. So you may want to do a little multitasking and delve back into some of the material on this on the web. No, seriously, you are going to be hearing a lot about budget reconciliation the weeks to come. You already are. And I think probably the two main things to keep in mind that Jim explained very clearly, in fact, is that it only takes a majority, 51 votes in the Senate to move it through, which is different, of course, than regular order in the Senate. And secondly, as Jim described, it relates only to direct spending programs. Those are mandatory programs like Social Security and loan programs on the spending side, and basically all of the tax code. And I wanted to, preface my comments on the tax code because budget reconciliation will very likely be used to make changes to the code in 2021, and led by Democrats. It's how Republicans passed President Trump's Tax Cut and Jobs Act in 2017. And so we are very closely watching this process, not just for how it might be used for spending programs, as Jim described, such as a TAC type program, but also for what might be done on the tax code. And on that point, there are two items on this slide that we're devoting in our priorities in terms of tax. We've mentioned them in different contexts previously. The first one is the taxation of Pell Grants. And we are advocating strongly for the elimination of that requirement. Under the tax code, Pell Grants get lumped into a category known as scholarships, which historically have been things like a private scholarship. And the idea behind that was that if you got some money from some kind of non-governmental entity to go to college, that while your college benefits should be tax-free, that any money that you were using for non-educational purposes should be taxed, just like income is regularly taxed. And so Pell Grants, when they were created, were put under that category in the tax code. And over time, it's become that that's clearly working against community college students, our neediest students, of course, who receive Pell Grants in two ways. The first way is the obvious one, which is that to tax a benefit, it by definition is received by people who pass a rigorous means test and go through the file of FAFSA and are determined to qualify for Pell Grant. And most students now have a 0 EFC and receive the maximum Pell Grant. To have those students, again, who by definition are needy, have to pay taxes on their grants really doesn't make much sense at all. Now, the reality is that most students are who are qualifying for Pell Grants are so low income that they don't generally have to pay taxes on those grants, but some of them do for their living expenses. And because we all know that, fortunately for most community colleges, the Pell Grant maximum, which will go up to $6,945 this July, more than covers the community college tuition. So your additional expenses beyond books are potentially subject to taxation. And we just think that that's a silly policy that should be changed. But there's a second reason why we are supporting the elimination of the tax on Pell Grants, and that is because of the way that the Pell Grant tax treatment interacts with the American Opportunity Tax Credit. And under the American Opportunity Tax Credit, all of that eligibility must go to tuition and fees and required materials. So let's take, for example, a community college student who pays $3,000 and qualifies for a American Opportunity Tax Credit of the maximum of $2,500. They can qualify for that maximum of $2,500 by applying their first $3,000 or that $3,000 of tuition to their AOTC eligibility. So that's great. They qualify for the maximum AOTC at $2,500. That's a good thing. However, all the remainder of their Pell Grant then is, because it no longer is allocated, as it were, for tuition, is subject to taxation. So you could have a very low income paying taxes on a $6,945 Pell Grant, and excuse me, I misspoke on that. It's $6,495. I misspoke that a couple times. Thank you, Jose, for nodding at least. That is we think that's just a really bad policy. And so the reason why budget reconciliation is important in changing this policy is because it's a time when it's easier to move tax legislation if the majority in both chambers wants to. And so we think that there will be support for this. There's a good amount of support. There's been bipartisan support in the past for this because people understand that Pell Grants aren't really designed to go to students who are fluent, and that this should be changed. So that's priority number one in the tax arena. And then the second one relates to the lifetime learning tax credit. And many of you probably aren't familiar with that because the American Opportunity Tax Credit is the big ticket item for community college students and all college students in the area of the tax code in terms of benefits that they receive. Having said that, for students who are non-credit students, or for students who are enrolled less than half time, which are the students who qualify for the lifetime learning credit, those students only get to claim this lifetime learning tax credit for 20% of their educational expenses, basically tuition that they pay. It doesn't cover non-tuition expenses. And the issue there is that 20% given community college tuitions doesn't really get you very far. So if a student is paying $800 over the course of a year for non-credit course, or just taking one course each of 2 semesters, they're getting 20% of that. It's not much money. Whereas that 20% can cover up to $10,000 of graduate and professional school education. Those students aren't eligible for the American Opportunity Tax Credit. So basically, we've got a lot of students in post-baccalaureate education who are receiving $2,000 a year of a subsidy from the federal government to do that, which is all well and good as far as we're concerned. But then we have our, generally speaking, working and less affluent community college students who are trying to get skills upgrades by taking courses, who are only getting a 20% of what they're paying, which is a much smaller amount. And we think the effect of the policy, whatever the intent of it, is wrong. And so we are proposing that lifetime learning credit be restructured to allow students who are taking courses in technical training areas that lead to jobs, and we're proposing that the requirements to be applied to that are essentially those that are in the Jobs Act, that those students should be able to claim the lifetime learning credit for 100% of their expenses so that they could get much more in the way of benefits. And we think that this would be a great way of incentivizing people in mid-career who want to get skills upgrades, don't qualify for Title IV assistance, for getting them some financial assistance. And finally, on this topic, the fact that this is named the Lifelong Learning Tax Credit is no accident. It was originally designed way back in the 1997 is when it was enacted. It was designed to help people who didn't qualify for this undergraduate AOTC. It was then the Hope Scholarship, but to help those students who wanted to get greater skills and develop their aptitudes, that through community college training primarily. It hasn't served that purpose, and so we think that that should be changed. So that's a little bit about tax, and again, budget reconciliation will be the vehicle for that. We think that it presents us with some great opportunities. We think that both of these issues will appeal to members on both sides of the aisle, and we're looking forward to advocating it with your assistance. Next slide, please. Yeah, the next slide is what we're calling invest in higher education and workforce development, but what that means is the appropriations process. And all of the programs that are on this slide here are programs that are funded by the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education subcommittee in the House and the Senate. In the House, that's going to be chaired by Rosa DeLauro, who's the full committee chairperson. In the Senate, that will continue to be chaired, we've just heard, by Senator Patty Murray, who of course most of you know is also assuming the chairmanship of the Senate Health Committee. So what we've got here is a list of the programs that we think are overall top priorities for our students in our colleges. There are probably too many programs for you to get into any level of detail with your members of Congress, but it is always a great idea, and we provide a federal funds worksheet for this purpose for you to show your members of Congress how these programs benefit your campuses. And you will know better, you will know best on how you should advocate for these, which programs have the biggest impact locally for you. The first two programs, federal supplemental educational opportunity grants and federal work study, are campus-based programs where the colleges receive allocations from the Department of Education. They have some discretion over how those funds are received by students, although for SEOG, priority has to be given to Pell Grant recipients. And some of our colleges get sizable sums from those programs and are well advised to mention their importance to members. The other three programs we've kind of lumped together on this second bullet: TRIO, Gear Up, the Champus program, Child Care Access means parents in school. And again, you'll know if your college receives one of those grants or would want to receive one of those grants, but they're extremely important programs. From my perspective, a good way to talk about them is that they complement and augment the Pell Grant and the other need-based student financial assistance programs by virtue of being targeted on lower income, in the case of TRIO, first generation college students; for Gear Up, students who are coming from high school, perhaps get benefit by state scholarships, and can use some extra support from the federal government in student success. Childcare is something we all know about. The next category of programs are institutional aid programs. I'm not going to take a lot of time to go into those today, but I'm sure that most of you on this call are from campuses that have received one of these grants, if not currently, at some point. I'll mention first the Hispanic Serving Institutions program, which is a growing program. Over 40% of all the so-called HSIs are community colleges, and currently it's really a very impressive and heartening trend at community colleges is that 28% of our students now are Latino students. And so, the average community college student population exceeds the 25% threshold that qualifies an institution for this program. You have to meet other criteria too, but it means that a lot of community colleges are receiving, can receive this program. We also have some historically Black colleges and universities that are community colleges that benefit through that program. And finally, I'll just mention it's the other largest program in the institutional aid area is strengthening institutions, which is a competitive grant program where traditionally about 70% of those funds go to community colleges. And so that is a very important source of support for our institutions. They tend to be colleges that have low resources and higher percentages of financially needy students. So we're always advocating for that because it's really, for all intents and purposes, largely a community college program. And then finally, before I turn things over to Jose, the next area of programs are job training and related programs that are funded through the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. That includes the relatively new Strengthening Community College Training Grant Program. I mentioned Appropriations Committee Chair Rosa DeLara from Connecticut. She was the champion of that program in fiscal year 2020, which was a new program then. It was funded at $40 million. There were 11 grants made. Some of them were state grants, some of them were individual institutions. We got a $5 million increase in that program in the fiscal year 2021 process. By all intents and purposes, or for all accounts, this is a really good program that we want to grow. We think Congresswoman DeLaro would like to see it grow. We're also supporting the program that Jim mentioned a few moments ago, a larger type program. This program, the SCCTG, as we use the acronym here in Washington, is also, though, we think a good design program that can provide a lot of helpful assistance for institutions that are partnering with business. Also, I'll mention we have longstanding support for career and technical education programs, particularly the Perkins Act programs, where we've received small but steady increases over the last number of years. So we find that very encouraging. And adult basic education, which got a smaller increase last year, but is an invaluable program where the need vastly exceeds the amount of funding that's made available. And of course, state grants that are then distributed to local workforce areas under WIOA that provide training. We know that there's not as much money in training as we might like there to be, but nevertheless, we strongly support WIOA, and that program also is way underfunded. And so if WIOA is important to your campus and you're engaged in your local one-stop center or the board, we do encourage you to speak on behalf of that. Thanks again, everybody, for being with us, and I'll turn things over to Jose.
Thanks, David, and thanks everybody again for being here. We'll shift over to the last section on the green sheet that we have for you all to discuss today. I'm not going to go too in deep onto these, but just for context, it's not last because it's not important, but it is last because of the timing of things. As you all know, the first probably 3, even maybe 4 or 5 months of this year are going to be taken up by pandemic issues, by pandemic relief. The Senate didn't get organized with their committees until late last week. They just started doing their hearings to move presidential appointees. And so we're not seeing the HEA being at the top of the list for things that are going to be happening in the next 3 to 4 months. That being said, it is still the law that governs what all of our institutions do, the ability of our students to access higher education. And so there's definitely a lot of priorities that we have in that realm. First and foremost is to create the federal-state partnership to enhance college affordability and enrollment. This is more commonly known as the College Promise Act. A couple of legislations have proposed this in the past. For example, during last Congress, House Democrats under Chairman Scott passed the College Affordability Act, which included a federal-state partnership to make community colleges tuition-free. As you may know, President Biden has expressed support for these proposals as well. And just yesterday during the Help Committee, Dr. Cardona, who is the president's pick to lead the Department of Education, also spoke very glowing remarks about community colleges and the need to make community colleges, to uplift them, to provide the resources and make sure that students can access them without financial barriers. Going off of that same vein about college affordability, extending the Pell Grant eligibility is another of our top priorities. We're just coming off a wonderful victory that we finally accomplished by getting Second Chance Pell authorized through the CRSSA, CRISA. in December, but now we're shifting focus to not only do we want for incarcerated students to have access to the Pell Grants, but we also want to make sure that students who enroll in shorter term programs are also able to benefit. We know that a lot of our community colleges offer strong programs that are shorter than the 500 clock hours that are required by Pell Grant right now. We know that these are programs that lead to high paying jobs that can lead our students into a middle class. So we want to make sure that financial barriers are not an obstacle in their ability to get trained and get certified and get into good paying jobs. So shortening the Pell Grant eligibility to 150 clock hours over 8 weeks of instructions is one of the priorities we'll be bringing to Congress over the course of the year. One of the bills that aims to do this, which has not yet been introduced for this Congress, as you may know, every bill that gets introduced once a Congress ends, so the 116th Congress ended in December, all of those bills get taken off. So offices have to reintroduce these bills again. So last Congress, the Jobs Act it's a bipartisan bill. It was introduced in the 116th Congress. It is going to be reintroduced likely in this Congress as well, but it has not yet happened. But that's one of the bills that would make the Pell Grant eligibility go from 500 clock hours to 150 clock hours. And then the one other major thing that we have with Pell Grant and strengthening the Pell Grant program is increasing its maximum award. Now, over the past couple of years, we've successfully managed to do this through the appropriations process, ensuring that the Pell Grant award at least increases to match inflation in order to ensure that students don't lose purchasing value. That being said, one of our big priorities for the HEA is ensuring that these maximum increases, these annual increases, happen automatically through the mandatory side, so that it's something that we don't have to fight through appropriations on an annual basis, and we can focus on strengthening the Pell Grant in other areas through appropriations. And then the couple of other things within the HEA that we definitely want to focus on for this year is investing in basic needs supports for students. As you all may know, and especially with this pandemic, the need that our students have has been exasperated, but even before the pandemic, we were seeing a lot of food insecure students. We were seeing a lot of students who were struggling with housing, with transportation, with medical care, and even our student parents struggling with childcare. So we want to make sure that as the HEA gets reauthorized, programs are authorized and strengthened to ensure that our students have the tools and the resources they need outside of the academic realm to be successful, to complete their programs, to stay in school and be able to graduate and then go on to good paying jobs. Some of the examples that we've supported previously, and which if they get reintroduced, which is likely going to happen this Congress, are programs like the Basic Act, which was introduced last Congress by then Senator Harris, now Vice President Harris. And on the House, it was also introduced by Congresswoman Torres from California. We're also supporting the ability to changes to strengthen C-Campus, SNAP food assistance, and SNAP enrollment and training for our students, so that our students have the ability to access these programs. Some of these programs they may already be eligible for, but they don't know how to, and there is a disconnect currently in the way the policy is written. So we want to make sure that our students have, the process is streamlined as much as possible so that our students have the resources they need to be successful. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jihan.
Good afternoon, everyone again. So we have some links for all of you. Please, if you have not registered for our National Legislative Summit, we are still taking registrations for our summit that starts on Monday the 8th at 10:30 in the morning. We also have group rates available for those institutions that would like to send more than teams of 4 to 6, teams of 7 to 10, and then teams of 11 or more. We especially love the teams of 11 or more. So if you can, if you haven't registered, please do so. On our website, we also have all of these materials. So we'll have the green sheet. We'll also have some of the webinars that we have done in the last 2 weeks. We also have our legislative agenda, and we also have our backgrounders. So on each of these issues that David, Jim, and Jose covered, we have a little bit more of a lengthy write-up on each of these subject matters. And with all things, you can always visit our two associations' websites. We're going to go through some questions. We answered a couple, and then we'll just kind of deal with them as they come. Brian, in terms of your question, the $97.3 billion ask is inclusive of all of higher education. And the way that we have made our ask is we wanted it to follow similar to Carissa through the reconciliation. They can't make substantive major changes to the current program. So we're asking for those additional dollars because we had originally asked for $120 billion last year, and we received 22.7. So let's see. Jim, do you want to cover any of these provisions for virtual distance learning on campuses?
Yeah, sure. I just add actually just a little bit more detail on the question you just answered, Ji Hang. So that money, if whatever money we get, whether it's the $35 billion that the president's proposed, the $97.3 billion, that again, that's for all of higher ed, like Ji Hang mentioned. It would also be, if it did go through the the Carissa bill and the structure there, which it would almost have to if it's done through budget reconciliation. Keep in mind that that money would also be the total amount. That would be comparable to the $22.7 billion under Carissa, which is for not only that main formula program for which you've all received your awards or you're in the process of receiving rewards for, but also any additional money for Title III and through the Title III and Title V programs and a couple other little funding streams there. But the vast majority of it would again go through that institutional formula program. In terms of the question about distance education support for that, I'll answer that in the context and assume that it was asked in the context of this legislation of additional funds through a pandemic relief bill. And the answer basically there is, well, yes. I mean, the basic rule, if you will, for these funds, for the institutional funds in particular, is that with the broadened use of funds language that there was under Carissa, that there does still need to be, even there still does need to be a somewhat of a nexus between what you spend the money on or what you've spent the money on or lost revenue as a result of. There has to be a connection between that, any of that, and the pandemic. So the connection is much looser than was required under the CARES Act, which really only spoke specifically to things that were connected to the disruption in campus operations. So we have a much broader use of funds, but there still is that connection to to the pandemic. It can't just be for anything, but obviously any additional expenses that you've incurred in terms that you still haven't covered in some way through the CARES Act or Carissa, that might, for any additional money that would come through this in the areas of distance education, would certainly be eligible to cover with any money you receive under that act. Yeah.
Okay. In that vein, there was also a question about broadband access equalizing or equal to basic needs.
Yeah, and I'll let Jose address that through the basic needs. I'll just add that there was money for broadband, and in particular was money for broadband at minority serving institutions through a grant program. Was I believe the amount was $275 million that was included in Carissa. They're just getting that underway. We'll actually be participating with some other groups and talking with the agency that's going to administer that program and learn more about that and get more information out to you all, and particularly those of you that are with minority serving institutions, that will potentially have a direct impact on you all. But that continues to be a focus, and I would not be, and definitely is a focus of the new administration. So I would not be surprised to see broadband very prominently included in anything moving forward.
Yeah, and I'll just like to add, I think you covered it really well, Jim, but I would just say for us in terms of the timeliness and making sure that we do get broadband access taken care of, our best avenue is through the pandemic relief, because there is an actual, like, as a result of the pandemic, we've seen the need of our students to have good broadband access, and a lot of the allowable uses for those funds, are, like Jim stated, are for institutions to ensure that their students are able to stay and enroll in distance learning education through broadband. I will also say, in our longer joint legislative agenda, we do have a specific section for broadband access included there too. But one thing I'll say, you're right, broadband access is part of the basic needs. And like we said earlier, what we want to do is for you to take the screen sheet and make it your own, tailor it to the needs of your institution. So if you find that for your institution, broadband access is a basic need, you can mention that, you can bring that up. So that's definitely something that's doable within the realm.
Okay, Jim, do you wanted to answer the Robert math question about CC job training?
Yeah, the question about whether, whether this would likely be a grant program. I mean, it almost certainly would be. As I mentioned in my comments, again here, and this actually addresses another question that was posed in terms of the, the nitty gritty of what we're proposing in a lot of these areas. It really does come down to the vehicle that's being used. And I want to get back into budget reconciliation again, but because that process, the reconciliation process, as we've all mentioned, really does limit what you can do in terms of actually spelling out the contours of a program, and is really limited to only those budget related provisions. It does depend on what the process used there for. So if in fact the next package that the Democrats would like to move forward after this one that's taking place right now does move through reconciliation, in that case, it is very likely that if we were to get a job training program, it would literally be the TAC program refunded again. The bill would simply have a line in it saying we are adding, whatever it is, $500 million a year for 4 years to this program, and all the rest of what the program looked like, the language around that would stay the same. So if it does not move through reconciliation, it would, as I mentioned before, then you have more options in terms of spelling out exactly what a program might look like. In either case, however, I think we are basically talking about a grant program, probably administered by the Department of Labor. But that's another question in and of itself.
David, do you want to answer? We have a question about the time frame to spend stimulus money. I guess under Carissa right now.
Right. So institutions were allowed to fold their CARES Act money into Carissa, and they, as part of that, they have a 1-year ability to use those funds from when they execute their supplemental grant with the Department of Education. So all of the Carissa money and leftover CARES money is available for that period of time. So yes, that there's a 1-year window, and college institutions can also ask for a 1-year extension of that as well. I keep in mind that while it's important on the one hand to allocate these funds over the course of the coming months, and we do unfortunately expect the colleges as enrollments are going to be down and they're going to be losing revenues as a result of that, and that there may be state budget cuts, so you want to be prudent about your use of those resources. We are hopeful that there will be more resources coming via the process that Jim described, with the Biden proposal on the table, and of course the proposal that Democrats have advanced as part of that in Congress, the 1.9 trillion overall. So we're hopeful that we're going to be getting more money on top of that. A lot of institutional issues to be resolved in terms of how you use that money and when you use that money, but we do expect that you will have, to answer the question directly, at least 1 year from the time that you draw down, that you certify that you would like these funds.
Jose, there's a Dreamer DACA question. Do you want to address that one?
Sure. I just want to say there was a question on how many Dreamers have become citizens. As Jim stated, one of the reasons why it's in our green sheet, and it's one of our long-time advocacy points, is because Dreamers do not have a pathway to citizenship at this point. DACA has been a very successful program, and SCOTUS upholding it was a very big win for the Dreamer community and for the many students that we serve that are DACA students. Unfortunately, that only provides a reprieve from deportation and from removal. It does not provide a pathway to legal permanent residence or citizenship, which is why we continue calling for something like the DREAM Act to be enacted into law so that these Dreamers do have a pathway to citizenship.
We also have a question about, are there any programs that encourage public-private partnerships through matching opportunities? Anybody want to take that one? Well, I will just say, Riza, I don't necessarily know which program you're talking about. Typically, there are the programs that we are asked to apply for typically have some type of institutional match or some type of in-kind match. So, but those type of programs might be more at the state level as opposed to the federal level. So that's a pretty broad question for us. Katie, you wanted to answer, you want to address the question on mental health?
Yeah, sure. So Timothy had asked if mental health services would be covered under increased investments for basic needs supports. And I just wanted to point out, I know mental health for students, is a huge issue for community college leaders, and they want to be, more involved in making sure students can get access to these services. And this is especially important now, considering the impacts of the pandemic as we move forward. So yes, that is something that we advocate for under the basic needs umbrella. We want to see more resources given to community colleges so that they can continue to partner with healthcare providers and mental health care providers, both by referring students to them outside of campus, but also having more of these services kind of embedded into campus life and kind of strengthening these partnerships between community colleges and mental health providers. So I just wanted to flag that.
And David, there's a question on the child tax credit.
It's a really good question, and there's no question but that an expanded child tax credit would target on low-income individuals would be of assistance to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of community college students. We haven't put that on our agenda because it's a little bit broader, if you will, a little bit outside the education area directly. But I appreciate your pointing that out because it is very important. And while we might not be able we just may not have the political bandwidth to make this a top priority, it is something that we need to remember. If enacted, will have a positive impact on our students and their ability to succeed in college. I'll just add one issue that we haven't talked about today, but is part of what we here in Washington are working on that's a little bit closer to what we talk with staff and members about, but is also an issue that is advocated on by many other people. And that issue is funding for state and local government. That's a big political flashpoint. It tends to be strongly supported by Democratic members, much less so by Republican members. But the ability of state and local legislatures and governments to get some support through the next stimulus bill to help them patch up some of their fiscal holes in places where they have them. Not every state, fortunately, does have that, but many do. That's something that we are talking more and more about, including in the communication we're sending to Congress just now on stimulus issues, because we know that what the states receive has a direct impact on the funding that our institutions and students do.
And yes, Wick, you posted something relative to SNAP. Yes, in the stimulus and overall appropriations bill that was passed last year, they did include a provision to allow increased access to SNAP benefits for individual, especially our community college students, as long as they had a 0 EFC or were participating in the work study program. So we think that was a significant change in that program. Okay, are there other questions?
There was, Jiheng, there was one question about the list being pretty comprehensive, and if we were going to prioritize any like 2 to 3 issues. I would say our priority number 1, first and foremost, is stimulus. One, because that is what's currently being talked about in Congress. That is currently the work that is being done. The House already passed their budget resolution, which sent instructions to 12 committees to get them language for reconciliation by February 16th. The Senate is expected to do that next week. So I would say our priority right now, number 1, is stimulus and ensuring that we do get the funds our institutions and our students need. And then from then on, it's looking, a lot of our priorities tend to reflect the work of the Congress and how they're moving on their timeline.
Let me just build on what Jose said, because I do agree with that. As part of that, and Jim talked about this in perhaps the second budget reconciliation bill that might be used by the Democrats to move their priorities, is a community college job training program. Because by definition, if we don't speak up for it, nobody else is going to. In fact, other interest groups are going to want to see training going through other vehicles that they receive a bigger share on. We truly believe that funding community college directly in partnership with business, and in some cases, state or local workforce investment parties, is a more efficient and more effective way of skilling up the economy and helping people recover from, economically from the pandemic. But it's very, very important that we speak up on behalf of that program, because again, if we don't, nobody will. The Biden-Harris campaign proposed a very large, huge job training program that included this. We're hoping that they'll be supportive of this as well. And then we also put the short-term Pell Grant eligibility as part of that clutch of issues. But we're looking for a major investment in job training, which we think is going to be essential for a variety of reasons as we move out of the pandemic.
Okay. Well, we're almost at time. I would just follow up. We do make the green sheet relatively lengthy. It is front and back document. We always encourage our institutions, based upon your priorities as an organization, to focalize on the top priorities of your institution. Obviously, we do provide a lot of priorities. Our legislative agenda includes a number of areas that are not on the green sheet. So if those areas are of particular interest, then you should definitely utilize them for your meetings up ahead. We're basically at 3 o'clock. So a couple of just announcements for all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. As we outline and release this, the green sheet, please visit our NLS website, nls.acct.org, if you need any additional information and copies of this. Again, we are going to be doing our NLS virtually. You should have been signed up to participate utilizing our Blue Sky account. And we look forward to seeing you bright and early on Monday morning, where our first speaker will be Amy Walter from the Cook Political Report. And if you have any questions, our information is all over the website. I'm sure many of you know how to reach us otherwise. And thank you again for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.